Right now, as you are watching this video, two of the most powerful nations on Earth are staring at each other across a single sheet of paper. One signature away from peace, one wrong move away from a war that could send oil prices to levels not seen in modern history, and the decision has to be made within 48 hours. Stay with me, because what is unfolding right now in the Strait of Hormuz, in Tehran, and in back-channel negotiations between Washington and Iran is one of the most high-stakes geopolitical standoffs of the 21st century. And most people still have no idea what is actually at stake here. A U.S. Navy F/A-18 Super Hornet took off from the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier and fired on an Iranian oil tanker attempting to break through the American naval blockade. Not a warning shot across the bow, actual rounds from a 20mm Gatling gun. On the same day, President Trump told reporters in the Oval Office they want to make a deal. It's very possible that we'll make a deal. Same day. Firing on a tanker and talking peace. That tells you everything about how dangerous and unpredictable this moment truly is. If you are new here, welcome to Verified Bulletin, where we break down what is actually happening in the world with verified facts, real data, and zero fluff. Hit subscribe right now because this story is moving fast and you do not want to miss a single update. Now, before we get into the 14-point document that is currently sitting on the Iranian government's desk, you need to understand the geography here, because that is where the real power lies. Picture a narrow stretch of water, just 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Ships moving in both directions, day and night. That is the Strait of Hormuz. A fifth of the entire world's oil and gas supply passes through this one choke point. Not a tenth, not a small percentage. 1/5 of everything your car runs on, everything factories burn, everything that heats homes across Europe and Asia, all of it squeezes through this one stretch of water between Iran and Oman. Now imagine that water is closed. Iran has been restricting transit through the Strait of Hormuz since early March, choking global energy flows and shipping. And in response, the United States imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports starting April 13th. Two blockades, two nuclear-armed spheres of influence, and a global economy caught right in the middle. Goldman Sachs has modeled scenarios where a prolonged Hormuz closure could push oil to over $150 per barrel. For context, the last time oil spiked anywhere near that level, it triggered economic pain across every continent. Airline tickets doubled, trucking costs exploded, consumer goods got more expensive almost overnight, and that was a temporary spike. What is happening right now is not temporary. This is a calculated economic siege, and it is working on both sides. Now here is what you need to understand about this document, about this one page that could end a war. The U.S. and Iran are close to agreeing on a one-page, 14-point memorandum of understanding. The memo would declare an end to the war in the region and start a 30-day period of negotiations on a detailed agreement to open the strait, limit Iran's nuclear program, and lift U.S. sanctions. 30 days. That is the window. Sign the paper, stop the shooting, then sit down and work out the full deal within a month. Sounds simple. It is anything but. Among other provisions, the deal would involve Iran committing to a moratorium on nuclear enrichment, the U.S. agreeing to lift its sanctions and release billions in frozen Iranian funds, and both sides lifting restrictions around transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Now pause on that second point for a second. Billions in frozen funds. Iran has been cut off from its own money sitting in foreign banks for years because of sanctions. That money represents real leverage, real economic pain, and it is one of the reasons the blockade is working so brutally fast. Iran relies on oil exports to fund its domestic programs, and the U.S. naval blockade has made that problem dramatically worse. But here is where it gets complicated. Here is where the disagreement is actually buried. The duration of the moratorium on uranium enrichment is being actively negotiated. Iran proposed a 5-year moratorium. The U.S. demanded 20 years. 3 sources say it would land at least at 12 years, with one putting 15 as the likely final number. Think about that gap. Iran offered 5 years. America demanded 20. They are currently somewhere around 12 to 15. That is not a small difference. That is a massive concession by Iran, and it tells you just how hard the blockade is squeezing them right now. Comment below. Do you think Iran will actually sign? Or will they delay again? Because here is the other thing you need to know about Iran's history in these negotiations. Both sides reported progress was made in previous rounds, but no agreement was reached. The U.S. president said most points were agreed to, but the only point that really mattered, nuclear, was not. He described Iran as unyielding on the issue. Iran has done this before. Come to the table, show flexibility, run out the clock, go home without signing. Trump knows this, and this time he is playing a different game entirely. Trump posted on Truth Social that if Iran agrees to the deal, the U.S. military offensive known as Operation Epic Fury will be at an end, and the naval blockade on Iranian ports would allow the Hormuz Strait to be open to all, including Iran. But if they don't agree, the bombing starts, and it will be, sadly, at a much higher level and intensity than it was before. At a much higher level. Those are not abstract words. The U.S. military has already demonstrated exactly what that means. Operation Epic Fury, which was launched on February 28 alongside Israel, targeted Iran's nuclear facilities, military leadership, and key infrastructure. The attacks included the assassination of Khamenei, as well as the assassination of Ali Larijani, a key figure in negotiations. When Trump says a higher level, the Iranian government understands exactly what he means. And yet, even in the face of all of this, Iran's parliament speaker posted publicly mocking the Axios report about the deal being close. Senior Iranian officials said publicly that the Americans will not obtain through a failed war anything they failed to gain in negotiations. One posted, quote, "Iran has its finger on the trigger and is ready." This is the impossible contradiction at the heart of this standoff. The Iranian regime is under enormous economic and military pressure, but the political survival of its leaders depends on not looking like they surrendered. That is the knot that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are trying to untangle right now through back channels. The U.S. negotiations are being led by Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff and son-in-law Jared Kushner. If both sides agreed on the preliminary deal, that would start the clock on 30 days of detailed negotiations to reach a full agreement. And Pakistan is the hidden player in all of this that almost nobody is talking about. President Trump announced the reversal of Operation Freedom on Truth Social, citing the request of Pakistan and other countries and what he described as great progress towards a complete and final agreement with Iran. Pakistan has been serving as the quiet diplomatic bridge between Washington and Tehran when direct talks have stalled. That is a fascinating geopolitical dynamic because Pakistan itself is navigating enormous pressures from both China and the United States simultaneously. Which brings us to the China piece. And this is where this story becomes truly global. Iran has stockpiles of uranium enriched up to 60%, with 90% needed to power a nuclear weapon. But beyond the nuclear dimension, there is a global economy hanging on this negotiation. China imports a staggering volume of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi met with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi, and both reaffirmed Iran's right to uphold national sovereignty and national dignity. Araghchi posted that Iran trusts China and looks forward to strengthening the strategic partnership between the two countries. China's energy security is directly tied to whether that strait stays open. European supply chains are being disrupted. Shipping insurance rates have exploded. Container ship rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope adds weeks and thousands of dollars per voyage to global trade costs. Every day this drags on, the economic damage compounds. Stock indices jumped and oil prices plunged on the news that the U.S. and Iran were close to a one-page memorandum, which appeared to be one of the strongest signals yet that an end to the more than 2-month war was coming into focus. Markets are watching every word from Witkoff and Kushner right now, because traders understand something that most people watching the news cycle do not. The difference between a signed deal and no deal could be hundreds of billions of dollars in economic activity across dozens of countries. Now, here is the part that should genuinely concern everyone watching this. Even with the more focused memorandum currently on the table, there are major hurdles between negotiators and the finish line. Chief among them is that officials say the administration is still entirely unsure whether the Iranian regime is united enough to agree to any deal. Also, any agreement that involves lifting the U.S. naval blockade on Iranian ports means lifting an immense amount of the economic pressure currently on the regime. Read that again. The U.S. is not even sure if Iran's own government is on the same page internally. Think about what that means. Different factions, different power centers, different calculations about survival. The Trump administration previously said that the first round of talks collapsed because the Iranian team had to return to Tehran to get approval to sign a deal. Iran does not have one decision-maker. It has a labyrinth of competing power centers, and getting all of them aligned on a historic concession like a 12 to 15-year enrichment freeze is genuinely complicated. Secretary Rubio said it plainly. He called some of Iran's top leaders, and this is a direct quote, "insane in the brain," and said it was unclear whether they would make a deal. This is the Secretary of State of the United States talking about the people America is negotiating with right now. If you have made it this far, hit the like button. Seriously, it helps this channel reach people who need to understand what is actually happening right now in the world, beyond the headlines. Here is what makes the nuclear dimension of this story genuinely alarming when you look at the raw numbers. In December 2024, the UN nuclear watchdog IAEA reported enrichment to levels approaching weapons grade and found an unprecedented stockpile of highly enriched uranium without a credible civilian purpose, giving Iran the capacity to produce enough fissile material for multiple bombs on short notice. Multiple bombs. On short notice. That phrase is not from a political speech or a campaign ad. That is the UN's official nuclear watchdog making that assessment. And it is why the nuclear moratorium terms in this memorandum are so critical. This is not a symbolic negotiation. This is about whether a nation that has openly called for the destruction of a neighboring country gets close enough to the finish line on nuclear weapons development to become untouchable. And that is precisely the calculation that Israel is watching from the sidelines with an incredibly focused eye. Israeli strikes in Beirut against Hezbollah continued even as these negotiations were progressing. Israel is not waiting. Israel is acting. And senior Israeli officials have said publicly that the U.S. naval blockade is getting, in their words, exponentially worse for the Iranian regime by the day. That pressure is not just military, it is psychological. Tens of thousands of Iranians took to the streets of multiple cities earlier this year, demonstrating against poor economic conditions, and were met with live ammunition. A regime that fires on its own people protesting economic conditions does not have unlimited domestic runway to absorb this much economic pain. The blockade is not just cutting oil revenues, it is starving the Iranian government of the resources it needs to manage its own population. That is why this moment, this specific 48-hour window, is genuinely unlike anything that came before it in this conflict. Trump said something to PBS that deserves attention. He said this war has a very good chance of ending, but he added, if it doesn't end, we have to go back to bombing the hell out of them. He said it casually. That casualness is itself a message to Tehran. Now, what are the realistic outcomes here, and what does it mean for you watching this video? Scenario 1. Iran signs the memorandum within 48 hours. The Strait of Hormuz reopens gradually. Oil prices drop sharply. Markets rally globally. A 30-day negotiation clock starts, and the world holds its breath while Witkoff and Kushner try to bridge the remaining gaps on uranium enrichment duration, weapons-grade material exports, underground facility bans, and the scope of sanctions relief. This is the best-case scenario for the global economy, and it is technically on the table right now. Scenario 2. Iran stalls, sends a counterproposal, introduces conditions, buys another few weeks of diplomatic limbo. The strait stays partially closed, economic damage compounds, and Washington's patience, which has already been tested across months of negotiations, erodes further. Scenario 3. No deal. Trump resumes bombing at what he himself described as a much higher level of intensity. At the outset of the conflict, the U.S. outlined 4 objectives: destroy Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, dismantle its navy, sever support for armed proxies, and ensure Iran never obtained a nuclear weapon. Those objectives are not fully achieved, not yet, and Trump's credibility now depends on either a real deal or a decisive military outcome. Which of these 3 scenarios do you think actually happens? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think because this community has been remarkably sharp in calling these developments ahead of time. Here is what we do know for certain right now as of this moment. An agreement has not yet been reached, and it is possible that the terms laid out in the framework could still change during negotiations toward a final agreement. CNN reported that the Iranian response could come as early as Thursday, citing sources familiar with the negotiations, while Pakistani sources familiar with the talks also described positive progress towards a deal. Thursday. That is the timeline. Hours from now. Iran's foreign ministry confirmed they received the memorandum and are reviewing it. Their response, whatever it is, will move markets, reshape military deployments, and determine whether the Strait of Hormuz opens or whether a 2-month war escalates into something far worse. 20% of the world's oil, a 1-page document, a 48-hour clock. This is not a regional dispute anymore. This is a story about who controls the arteries of the global economy, whether nuclear proliferation gets walked back or accelerates, and whether American maximum pressure strategy actually works against a regime that has absorbed decades of sanctions and still survived. The answer to that question will be known very soon. Subscribe to Verified Bulletin right now if you are not already subscribed, because when Iran delivers its response, we will be breaking it down in full detail with verified information and real analysis. No speculation, no spin, just exactly what happened, what it means, and what comes next. One final thought before you close this video. The last 2 months have permanently altered the Middle East's strategic landscape, regardless of what happens in the next 48 hours. Iran's military capacity has been severely degraded. Its supreme leader was killed, its top negotiator was killed, its proxies are under simultaneous pressure, and its economy is bleeding. Whatever deal emerges from this, if one emerges at all, it will be negotiated from a position of Iranian weakness, unlike anything in the history of the Islamic Republic. Whether that weakness leads to a genuine, verifiable nuclear agreement, or whether it leads to a cornered regime making desperate choices, is the most important geopolitical question of 2026. And right now, nobody, not in Washington, not in Tehran, not in Beijing, knows the answer. Watch this space. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening, and I will see you in the next breakdown.